all of us know that we are moving towards COP17 in just 4 days' time. It begins on 28th November at Durban. And in developing countries, most of the people's groups and civil society organizations think that it will be a watershed for climate governance and resolving the issues that we have been trying to look into since COP15 at Copenhagen, and though it was also supposed to be a sort of watershed for climate change negotiations at international level, but unfortunately that could not be. So before I go to lay down a brief priorities and possibilities from our side, from coalition side, I'll take a couple of minutes to lay down a brief background of the organizations which are associated with the coalition. And beyond Copenhagen, coalition came into existence in the run-up to Copenhagen, and it's sort of coalition of more than 40 networks and organizations working in all over India on issues of sustainable agriculture and food security, environment, climate justice and sustainable development, various aspects of sustainable development. Since last 2.5 years, we have been trying our hands at various aspects related to climate change impacts, climate change governance, etc. in India, and also partly in South Asia. There are a few of the groups which are working at South Asia level. We have been trying to connect climate change to the impacts, and we have been observing that there is minimal documentation of the kind of impact climate change is producing in India, especially in the agriculture. And whenever we try to look at some sort of projections and climate change impacts on agriculture in India, we are always informed by the discussion and conversation that this will happen in 2050. By 2050, the agricultural production will reduce by such and such percentage. But there are very few documentation on what is the kind of impact that is already taking place. So in that context, we have organized a couple of public hearings, which has been a representation of various interests and variety of stakeholders, including farmers, experts, civil society organizations, affected population, farmer, women, etc., etc. Besides that, we have been also trying to connect with policymakers on state response to climate crisis in India, and we have been trying to sort of monitor National Action Plan on Climate Change and State Action Plan on Climate Change. This year itself, we have tried to engage with the State Action Plan on Climate Change process in different states, and we organized 3-4 consultations in Manipur and Uttarakhand and in Madhya Pradesh and Bihar. And what we have found, unfortunately, that even the state action plans are being influenced largely by the process which is taking place at international negotiations in terms of offering solutions. They are closer to international negotiations rather than the grassroots realities in India. So that's been an unfortunate part, but we have been trying to engage with different state governments in trying to bring perspective of affected population and farmers in these plans. At the international negotiations, our focus of intervention is largely on bringing due focus on agriculture in climate change negotiations. And we believe that there should be a distinction between how we treat agriculture in developed countries and how we talk about agriculture in developing countries, because as all of us know that agriculture has a multi-dimensional role in developing countries, and it's not just an economic activity as it is in developed countries, and it's the main source of livelihood and food security for a majority of people, even up to the extent of 70-80% in different developing countries in South Asia and also Sub-Saharan Africa. We are greatly perturbed at the trend of negotiations on agriculture, especially in the climate change negotiations, and the current focus on mitigation and trying to bring agriculture, trying to use agriculture as sink. So on this note, we have been trying to put our concerns to various official delegations also and global civil society in COP. Besides, we have been also talking about legal architecture in terms of state and non-state liability and responsibility at international level, and we have felt that there is a minimal legal framework and institution at international level which is looking into, say, concerns which are expressed by communities in different developing countries and concerns related to compliance and enforcement. So we are very thankful for all of us who have been able to make out some time for this consultation. I warmly welcome Mr. Robert Donkers to this consultation, and he is the Councillor Minister for Environment in EU delegation to India. And we hope to have your perspective on how we are approaching COP17 and what have been the sort of trends in international intersessional conferences that we have had before COP17. We are also expecting representation from Republic of South Africa to inform us on what kind of bilateral and multilateral efforts they are making and how they see what kind of possibility of a global fair deal they see taking place in COP17. So though we had sort of planned to begin with Mr. Mark, Councillor from High Commission of the Republic of South Africa, but I think he's still on his way and will take some time to make it to this place. So in the meantime, I would request Mr. Robert Donkers to inform us on how EU sees the possibility and how to define the fair deal in COP17 and what are the possibilities that you see on various aspects of climate change negotiations in terms of mitigation, in terms of moving towards second commitment period, and in terms of climate change, climate finance and technology transfer, which are supposed to be priorities for COP17.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must say I didn't come here to take the floor as first person, especially not seeing the title that the meeting is about a development country perspective. Well, you can say a lot about the European Union, but it is not developing. And if it's developing, given the financial crisis, it's developing in the wrong way. So I'm happy to engage later in the discussion, but if you allow me, then I will say something about what we expect from Durban in terms of what could be the outcome. And I can say from the outset I'm not very optimistic, but I'm sure I'm not the only one in the room. For a couple of reasons. First, of course, the position, or rather not position, of the United States, which is, for internal reasons, of course, not in a position to engage in a, I would say, sophisticated way. It's now more engaging in a way that it is trying to postpone discussions and also discourage other parties to engage, including India, is my strong feeling. So that's one, and we can come back to that. Unfortunately, with or without, let's say, influence of the United States, I have to say a little bit the same about India. If I look what the minister has said last week Thursday in a meeting in the CSE, then I'm afraid we are back before Ramesh times. I'm not saying that necessarily what Minister Ramesh has been doing was always important in the sense that this could make and help make a deal, but certainly he was more engaged in terms of finding common ground and also debating issues than I've seen so far of the new minister. And we regret that. And unfortunately, she is not willing to discuss even with parties like the European Union, other than via the press. And that is not exactly how I see a good cooperation or a partnership developing before and not at Durban as well. So both the US, China, India, they have already stated that they don't want to go to a legally binding instrument. Well, if the legally binding instrument, and then the US of course doesn't bother much about the Kyoto Protocol, and the other countries want a second commitment of the Kyoto Protocol, and if not, then they don't want to talk. Well, the official position of the European Union is that we are happy, no, happy is maybe too much said, but we are ready to engage on a second commitment period for the Kyoto Protocol. But then we shouldn't be alone. I mean, what's the point of being a member of a club of one? And we, as you know, we have already our unilateral ambitions, and not even ambitions, it's already in the legislation, to go to minus 20% in 2020, and we can do more if we have a more, I would say, if the club is larger, and if there is even more if there is an international agreement. So we don't need to state targets on a second commitment period. We have them already. We have already said 20% below in 2020 and 85 to 90% below in 2050. That's official EU policy. So if then, with knowing that Canada, Japan, Russia doesn't want to engage in a second commitment period, I have the feeling that we're going around in circles. If you then demand, not only India, but a lot of other countries, the second commitment period, then you're hiding behind each other. So that doesn't make me very optimistic about Durban. Your point about technology transfer and maybe RED, etc. I think on some of those part files, part issues, financing, we can certainly, if we want, we can make some agreements, which then of course are subject to an overall agreement, because nothing is decided until everything is decided in international business. But I think we can make some progress there. I don't have the figures with me because I didn't expect to be speaking at this moment. But first, the fast funding, the fast track funding. The ministers of finance of the European Union last week engaged for the second round of fast track funding, and with that money, which we promised 7.2 billion euros over 3 years, we are now with that decision of last week or the week before, we have now engaged already or 70% of the money we promised. I see some messages in the press that complaining that India doesn't get anything. Indian government has officially said they don't want any money of that, on the fast track money, because the Indian government, I think they have a point, they said, well, this should go to the countries in more need than India for this particular, I would say, short-term fund. So again, this altogether, whether this is the nice spinning of the press, which we have in Europe as well, of course, or this is input from other quarters, I don't know. But anyway, it doesn't set an atmosphere, and that's my concluding remark for the moment, doesn't set the atmosphere to create expectations and to see, okay, well, we are now finally going to do business in Durban. So I'm afraid that we can get home probably with some part agreements if everybody wants, but if the focus is only on whether the EU and some other countries like Norway, Switzerland commit a second period, then I think we can better stay home. It saves also a lot of airplane tickets and also emissions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Donkers. We understand and completely appreciate the position of European Union, and yeah. And we understand that global problems will have to be solved through global solutions rather than a group of countries or particular countries doing it. And until unless we have everybody on board, it might not be possible to keep the rise in temperature below 2 degrees Celsius that I think all the countries, 192 countries, have already committed. So thank you very much for your remarks, and in the meantime, we also welcome Mr. Robert Ferris, First Secretary, Embassy of Philippines. Welcome Mr. Ferris. हम लोग बीच में श्री गांववासी जी का भी स्वागत करते हैं. गांववासी जी, आपका बहुत बहुत स्वागत है. Mr. Gaonwasi is a former rural development minister from state of Uttarakhand. Now, in the meantime, now that Mr. Soumya Datta has also arrived, can I request you to sort of lay down what are the priorities from Indian perspective and from developing country perspective in COP17? We also welcome you.
Can I get a little time, because I was little late, tied up with another climate crisis meeting. Just 10-15 minutes.
Yeah.
If the discussion picks up, I can just sense what is.
So then I would now request Mr. Robert Ferris to share his reflections on what we think that is possible in COP17. You are welcome to share your country position, but I think we have had a very short time that we could give for preparation to missions. So you are also welcome to share your personal reflections and positions, if that's possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm assigned here to read some essential points from our government in the run-up to COP17. The Philippines continues to uphold the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, where developed countries acknowledge the responsibility that they bear for the current state of the global environment. Now, a worrying trend in climate assistance is that least developed countries and small island states are currently being prioritized as beneficiaries of climate change assistance, particularly with regard to fast start financing. On the other hand, there are many non-LDC and non-SIS countries like the Philippines that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change but do not qualify in climate assistance programs. Some embassies and high commissions have in fact been told that the Philippines is not a priority country for climate assistance because it is not poor enough. I guess we fall under the category same as India. Nor is it an LDC or a small island state. Thus, there is a need to emphasize vulnerability as defined in the preambular paragraph 19 of UNFCCC and ensure that the Philippines qualifies for climate assistance. The convention defines vulnerability as including, and I quote, countries with low-lying coastal, arid, and semi-arid areas or areas liable to floods, drought and desertification, and developing countries with fragile mountainous ecosystems are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. Much more money around the world flows into mitigation activities rather than adaptation actions. Yet adaptation is the priority of the Philippines. The international community stands at a point where even the most aggressive and immediate actions to mitigate climate change will not stop the impacts at least for the next half of this century. While deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions may buy time for human and natural systems to adapt in decades ahead, we must also begin dealing with the unfolding impacts of climate change now. It seems that every year the Philippines is on crisis mode with our typhoons getting stronger and stronger. In the Philippines case, climate change impacts include more intense tropical cyclones, drastic changes in rainfall patterns, sea level rise, and increasing temperatures, which all have serious implications on the country's natural ecosystems. Food security, water resources, human health, public infrastructure, energy, and human settlements. Funding for adaptation thus needs to be made available to the country in a manner that is predictable and sustainable, and that is driven by the country's concerns and priorities. I'll skip some bullets. The 16th conference to the UNFCCC held in Cancun brought back international confidence in the multilateral process with the adoption of the Cancun agreements by all but one of the countries party to the convention, and presented incremental but important achievements such as the creation of a Green Climate Fund, the adaptation framework, and the technology mechanism, and a sincere effort to try to balance mitigation. This is in stark contrast to the events of COP15 in Copenhagen and the controversial Copenhagen Accord, which was crafted by the heads of state of only 30 or so countries out of the 193 parties to the UNFCCC. More importantly, the near universal adoption of the Cancun agreements could be regarded as having superseded the Copenhagen Accord. Therefore, there may be reason to expect donor partners to be less insistent on the country's accession to the accord as a condition for bilateral climate assistance. Meanwhile, in the run-up to COP17 in Durban, parties to the convention will discuss the continuation of the commitment period or second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol. The first commitment period ends in 2012. Without an agreement, developed countries or Annex I countries will not be bound by numerical targets of emissions reductions and a situation of voluntary emission reductions, which would likely not be up to the degree required to address global warming could precariously result. In addition, legally binding commitment on mitigation under Convention, LCA track, mobilization of resources for the Green Climate Fund, and the operationalization of the adaptation framework and technology mechanism are hoped to come out of the Durban Conference. On new and additional resources for climate change efforts, following the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, the Philippines maintains that Annex I countries should extend climate financing to developing countries over and above existing ODA. In fact, developed countries are required under the Convention, Article 4.3, to provide new and additional resources, likely through a blend of bilateral, multilateral, or regional funding modalities, to meet the agreed costs of developing countries in complying with their climate change-related obligations. Moreover, based on elevation and population exposure, the Philippines came out as one of the 10 countries in the world which are highly vulnerable to sea level rise, which will cause population displacement, the loss of arable land in coastal areas, and the inundation of low-lying areas, thereby leading to loss of income, and exacerbate saline intrusion into the country's freshwater resources, increase the potential damages from storm surge and tsunami, and worsen land subsidence impacts, among others. Our National Mapping Resource Center and the Manila Observatory estimate that at least 89,900 hectares of land will be lost from a 1-meter rise in sea levels. Greenpeace estimates that 64 out of 81 provinces and at least 703 municipalities will be affected by the same amount of sea level rise. Last 3 points. On the Cancun agreements and the run-up to COP17, the Philippines was not one of the supporters of the accord crafted by the 30 or so countries. However, the near universal adoption of the Cancun agreements could hopefully render the Copenhagen Accord superseded, such that the Philippines may have reason to expect donor partners to be less insistent about the country's accession to the accord as a condition for bilateral climate assistance. On the domestic front, the National Climate Change Action Plan was just signed by our President, and the NCCAP prioritizes the country's adaptation efforts in the short, medium, and long term in the context of the socio-economic transformation that climate change will require of the country. The NCCAP will operationalize the National Framework Strategy on Climate Change for 2010 to 2022 and facilitate the identification of adaptation programs in need of external foreign funding. Thank you very much for bearing with me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ferris. Can we come back to you, Mrs. Soumya?
Thank you. I'd like to be a little possibly uncomfortable to some of us here by starting with this fact that many of the movement groups, many of the people who are actually experiencing the adverse impacts of climate change have tried to engage with this issue for the last 3 to 3.5 years and developed a position which is at considerable variance to the position that the Indian state has taken. That is the position of the government of India. That's one clear fact that I have to state here. And there are very many valid reasons for that. Second, I'd like to pick up on some of the points that I just heard. See, one of the very clear targets that we earlier thought has been diluted, that we all know, the very important aspect of mitigation. But what the representative of from Philippines have pointed out also has a very important aspect. Because today, as we know, roughly, and climate finance is not only in terms of the money, the funding that is coming from the World Bank's different funds. One of the major methods is the market mechanism. The CDM, dominant today, and RED Plus is coming. It's on a experimental basis, on a pilot basis, this has started. And we have very clear concerns, 3-4 very critical concerns about this. Concern number one is, as pointed out, roughly around 82% of the total climate finance today is going for mitigation. In name of mitigation, not for mitigation, that we must understand, in the name of mitigation. And what is this mitigation, what are these mitigation measures? Today the dominant mitigation measures are CDM projects. And we have very clear studies, not only from India, but a large number of countries where CDM projects are operative. And we know China is the biggest recipient of CDM money. India is the biggest number of projects, but the second largest recipient of CDM money. And European Union countries or entities are the biggest buyers of these credits. That is, majority of the money is coming from European Union countries. The result of this is nothing positive in terms of mitigation, because that is in terms of transparency, leakage and corruption. But apart from that, what we must understand is the communities that are facing these CDM projects, who are located around these CDM projects, and if you are interested, we'll hand over concrete studies. We have now reports of other groups, other friendly groups who have come out with reports of very large number of this, that they are getting a secondary impact. First impact of adverse climate change is the physical impacts, the unpredictability of the climate system, extreme rainfall events, drought. The secondary impacts are from the projects which are supposed to mitigate. And those are having large number of human rights violation, denial of basic minimum resources access to them, and also displacement to a very large scale. So if Philippines is interested in this kind of climate finance, I would suggest that they steer clear of this climate finance, and really, or not only Philippines, any country which looks to climate finance should steer clear of this kind of market-driven, profit-driven climate finance. The other kind of climate finance is very important, but there are important concerns in that area too. We know very clearly that 2003 onwards, there are concrete figures of what is the money required for these impacts, and there's no point in reiterating that who are creating this, who are contributors of this crisis. The Stern review pointed out to figures of around $200 billion per year, which is required roughly, and that was in 2003-2004. From that, we came down to the fast-track finance of roughly $10 billion per year from 2010 to 2012. And if to put it in perspective, last year's flooding, devastating flooding in Pakistan, and here it will be good to note that any property lost in Pakistan, any house, single house or home lost in Pakistan is valued much less than a house lost in US or in Europe. A life lost in Pakistan or India is valued much less. But even with that, the last year's flood damage, which is clearly something connected with the climate extreme events, is conservatively valued at $30 billion. That's a conservative estimate that has been done. And we are talking about climate finance from 2010 to 2012, the fast track funding is $10 billion per year. And roughly half of that is committed. And we are talking about $100 billion per year from 2020, and nobody knows what happens in between and what this $100 billion will be in value, in real value in 2020. So all these are questions I think we should target very clearly what we are demanding. Just saying that we, as the representative from Philippines says, because the Bangladesh government is saying the same thing. Bangladesh is LDC. Bangladesh is far more impacted. And if you look at World Bank figures, World Bank data, what World Bank came out with, they listed 5 climate extreme events: drought, flood, 1 meter rise, agricultural loss, like this. And they listed 12 countries in each of these categories. India is in 3 of them. India do not need fast track finance, that is Indian government position, because India is not as poor as Bangladesh, but roughly around 77% of Indians are as poor as any average Bangladesh people. But India is in 3 of this out of the 12 most vulnerable countries. Bangladesh is in 3 of this. Pakistan is in 2 of this. So when we are talking about countries like us, it's not that we are not vulnerable, as Philippines representative has pointed out, they are equally vulnerable. But the question is capability, which comes from respective capability. I think in that term, India's position has changed. But I'd like to also mention this, probably we agree with the Honorable Representative from the EU that Indian government's proactive engagement with international players have gone down quite a lot, and that obviously has got a lot to do with a new minister who had very little understanding of the entirety of the issues or the complexity of the issue, and being very new, she probably will be taking quite a lot of time to get engaged. And Jairam Ramesh was obviously by nature probably more engaging. But the other problem here that I'd like to point out is, see, we have been also trying to engage both within the so-called civil society space, as well as with the state mechanism in India, at the national level and at the provincial level, which we call state governments, for the last 22 months or so. And there are things of concern, there are things which are ringing alarm bells in many circles. I'd like to flag a few of them. The first I started with is the mechanism that is dominating now for mitigating climate change, that is the CDMs, are themselves causing far more harm in many communities in India that we have seen, far more harm than the physical harm that the physical climatic system change is causing today. That's something to be noted. So we must evolve a mechanism which is not driven by the market's conditions, which is driven more by adaptation needs, because this is also very skewed. We have on the one hand roughly 3 billion people which are quite vulnerable. On the other hand, something like only 17 to 18% of the total climate money goes for adaptation. The rest goes to mitigation, and mitigation means big projects or big developers. Almost nothing reaches the communities. And even in terms of so-called this forest carbon partnership projects, which are supposed to give communities some benefit, we have calculated whether it is Kenya or whether it is the Himachal government project in India, the communities get given peanuts for involvement of years together. Like in the Kenyan project, there is very clear calculation that each family will get something like $10 a year after 3 years, which is negligible. In Himachal, the similar kind of impacts is coming to around 372 rupees, which is around $8 per year for a family, which is again negligible. So when we talk about financing, climate financing, the realities and the figures and the how they compare with needs and where the needs are, I think these are very important areas. But the other area that I would like to just flag is our engagement and the learning out of that. As I said, last almost 2 years we are engaged very intensively also with the state mechanism. And not only in the national level, also in the state level. Like Philippines have come up with a new plan, India has come up with a national action plan more than 3 years ago. It was June 2008. And we critiqued it quite a lot at that time, saying or pointing out or analyzing that this national action plan really is talking about business as usual program. Many of the earlier, our 5-year plan processes have been just given a cover. Apart from that, it had no targets, no target dates, no target figures. So those are our critics. I'm saying, as I started with, that today Indian civil society has a fairly evolved position on the climate crisis, what its redressal mechanism should be, and which is substantially different from what the Indian government's position is. The other alarming feature of all this planning in the government circle, that is the state response to the climate crisis, is many of them are looking at the money by commodifying the crisis. And the commodity is called CERs. How many CERs you can sell, and where do you get these CERs, the certified emission reductions, from? It has got almost nothing to do with impacted communities. It has got very little to do with what kind of adaptation need is there. it has got very little to do with actual impact, what is happening. Some of our groups, like Mr. Nagaraj is sitting, he has led a study. We have done some study of actual ground level impacts, what is happening in non-Indian communities. And the Indian government plans, both at the national levels, the NAPCC, and the 18 state action plans that are first drafts are ready out of 28 states. None of these are based on any impact study on the ground. It's a grave consequences. If you are planning for addressing climate crisis without knowing, without doing studies of what is happening on the ground, what the communities are facing, then you are doing some imaginary exercise which is not going to address the crisis. So that's one area of grave concern. But the second area, as I was mentioning, this is again a consultant-driven process. World Bank, DFID, GIZ, these are driving our climate action plan formulation. It is a non-transparent process. There is hardly any public participation in any level. So, and these agendas, the agendas or plans that are being that are included in the state action plan on climate change, which are called SAPCCs, and as I said, out of 28, 18 SAPCCs, that is 18 state governments have finalized their first draft of action plan. These have been built in a very small scales, except where some of our groups, we have been successful in pushing it for the last 2 years to open up. Manipur happened in July. Assam, we had some consultation. Uttarakhand with the presence of the minister. And I must bring this up. When we started the consultation, for the first time in Uttarakhand as a state, is a reasonable sized state, the ex-minister was just minister, then he said, I don't know. The VC of the Central University, out of the most important university there, he said, I don't know. All the people who are connected with this issue, they said, we don't know that the state has an action plan. And we could circulate that action plan. And how this action plan has been formulated, none of the important so-called stakeholders of the state know that it exists. We face the same situation in Karnataka. The major players, the stakeholders, didn't know that EMPRI has brought up an action plan. This is the area number 2, which is of grave concern. But the third area I would like to point out, as I said, not only that it is a consultant-driven process being done in a small cell, in total darkness or opaqueness, but many of the agendas being adopted are being driven by the World Bank and DFID, and many of these agendas we have very grave concern about are like 1 or 2. One, any state that has got any forest, they are planning to sell their forest carbon stocks in the coming REDD+ markets. Many of them have adopted clearly Western consultant, Western corporation driven agendas like green expressways, low carbon green expressway in a state like Manipur, where every 100 meters you have to take a car in the mountains. You have buildings, LEED certified buildings in states like Manipur and Nagaland, and I'm not going into the little list. The idea is very clearly the action plans that are being made, and it's not much different in Bangladesh. I have not seen the Philippines plan. I have gone through the Bangladesh plan. The Bangladesh groups have not yet seen it in detail. So these are areas as civil society and government, quasi-government interface we must bring up. We must not limit our consideration to only, as you said, that some funds are to be coming, so how much we can get, we should also get. These are areas where even if funds come, like 2 funds have come in Bangladesh, which are largely for adaptation. The Resilience Fund and the Multi-Donor Trust Fund. Both are by World Bank. Both are driving large-scale projects. None of them are really targeting the actual communities who are losing their livelihoods, their lands, and their everything. So this needs to be kept in mind. And when we talk about any response, any meaningful response, we should critically analyze and synthesize what needs to be done rather than what is being given by some higher bodies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Datta. I think all of us share your frustration of India's state response not being adequate and not being up to the mark in terms of climate crisis and climate change policies. And we definitely also share the frustration expressed by Mr. Robert Donkers and representative from Philippines, Mr. Ferris, on India's not having very clear stand in international positions and sort of having a regressive stand. We are also sort of not endorsing the position of Government of India in international negotiations for so many various reasons. And we have been trying to get in touch with policymakers on so many issues related to climate change and parliamentarians. And with that objective, we are organizing also a discussion which will immediately follow this discussion on from climate change to climate crisis, India's national policy on climate change and parliamentary oversight, where we expect to have a handful of members of parliament to discuss these issues. In the meantime, I also welcome Mr. Charlie Pop, who is First Secretary from Embassy of Belgium. You're most welcome. And I remember that Charles has having seen both the worlds. Earlier he was involved with Greenpeace, if I'm sure. Okay, okay. So we welcome you, and we invite you to share your reflections on how you see that we are approaching COP. What are the priorities? What are the possibilities? How far do you think that we are from a fair global deal on climate change?
I think my colleague Rob from the EU delegation has earlier presented the EU point of view, and Belgium aligns itself with the EU negotiating stance ahead of the COP. So we're fully in line with the position that's been presented. Obviously, I guess Belgium still believes a deal is possible, but like every negotiation, everybody has to make compromises, and it remains to be seen whether everybody can show flexibility. It's a negotiation. That's the way it goes. So we're still hopeful, I guess, as Europeans. But yeah. So I'll just remain at that.
Thank you so very much. Now, can we take a sort of round of concerns or reflections from the participant? We have been informed that representative from High Commission of South Africa will be arriving here in 10 minutes. So that gives us some sort of opportunity to engage with the representatives that are already present here. और कुछ लोग जो शायद हिंदी में बात करना बेहतर पसंद करते हैं, उनका भी स्वागत है कि वो हिंदी में भी अपनी बात रख सकते हैं. हम लोग कोशिश करेंगे उसको, अगर अंग्रेजी में तर्जुमा करने की ज़रूरत होगी तो शायद हम लोग वो भी कर सकते हैं. But I invite all of you to share your concerns or raise your concerns with regard to COP17 or India's climate change policy, whatever you prefer. Yeah, please go ahead. Please introduce yourself briefly and go.
I'm Suman. I teach in one of the colleges in Delhi University. I teach political science. I'd like to congratulate our representative from European Union that they have a climate change policy and that they will be reducing 20% by 2020. In fact, it's quite different from what we are doing in SAD, though we pay a lot of lip service, but we don't have a climate change policy. But sir, we will like to know your opinion about Kyoto Protocol and what does EU feel about the Kyoto Protocol?
With pleasure. I think we are very positive about the Kyoto Protocol. We will be meeting our 2012 targets, or probably even doing better than the 8% we promised. On the 20%, we are currently around 13-14%. So we will make that as well, and probably do better. All what is in the Kyoto Protocol, and by the way that goes from almost every international convention or protocol, we translate into European legislation, which has to be implemented by all individual member countries, so 27 members of the European Union. And if it is regarding products standards, then it's even followed by other countries like Norway and Iceland and Liechtenstein. So we are very positive about the Kyoto Protocol. The problem is we are the only ones who are really living up to the targets. If you look at Canada, if you look at Australia, if you look at other countries, they are not. Now, you can also criticize the European Union per country, because of course all the European, well not all, Malta, Cyprus didn't take targets at the time, but we're not members by the way at that point in time anyway. Some of the countries within Europe are doing worse than they promised, but we have a collective target of 8%. And thanks to extra efforts of other countries, like the United Kingdom, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, etc., we are doing better than collectively than we were promising at the time. But because of the legislation which I mentioned, we take the countries who are not performing to task, and we even take them to court. And that is happening. Like Greece or Portugal, Spain, who within our club, if you like, were allowed to grow. I wouldn't call them developing countries because that wouldn't be appropriate, but new member states like Bulgaria, Romania, etc., they are poorer than some G77 countries like Singapore, Saudi Arabia, etc. So they are allowed from the collective EU to grow in emissions, but it has to be compensated by the richer part of the European Union. So we take Kyoto very seriously, but as I mentioned in my opening statement, we don't see the point in setting new targets in the second commitment period if we're the only ones, because we already have our targets and they are legally binding targets. We also attach a lot of importance to the Kyoto mechanisms. In that sense, however, I agree with a lot of what you said. I don't agree on the CDM because it was meant to be clean development mechanism. That is not adaptation, that's mitigation. So this is a bit of circular reasoning. You cannot criticize something for being focused on mitigation if it is set up to focus on mitigation. What I agree with you is that it doesn't work properly. And why doesn't it work properly? Because a lot of the mechanisms are much too heavy. And you said about consultants, I fully agree with that. If you have a project and you need an independent consultant to verify whether the project is sound, how many credits it could deliver, etc., that costs a fortune. And sometimes then it's not even worth to ask for the CDM credit. The second thing, however, still in favor of this mechanism, is that it has not delivered what it was supposed to.